Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
The Erik Ten Hag era continued, with a 2-2 draw in pre-season, thanks to goals by Sancho and a Matty Cash own goal, whilst Leon Bailey and Callum Chambers netted for the Villains. Today we're going to look at what Ten Hag's tactics were in possession. We will assess Ten Hag's defence and pressing a little bit later on, so hit subscribe if you don't want to miss out. Let's look at the tactics.
And this is how both managers chose to line up for this match, courtesy of the OneFootball app. OneFootball is the best football app around, and I'm happy to say they're sponsoring this video, and you can download it for free through the link in the description below. It will give you formations like this for every league you choose to follow, but you can also follow individual players. You can get stats for both, news, and so much more, and by downloading through the link below, you get the best free football app around and help to support the channel.
When Manchester United had the ball in deeper areas, Villa weren't really looking to press that high up. That meant that United could come out through the first phase relatively easily. And United had quite a strong structure in the build-up. Fred was the sole pivot, whilst Van der Beek and Fernandes would both move much higher. To begin with, both fullbacks played pretty much as traditional fullbacks, pushing slightly higher ahead of the centre-backs. So United generally built up with a well-defined shape. Initially, the centre-backs were deep, with the fullbacks taking up fairly traditional roles. Fred was the key man as he was the single pivot in the midfield, so it was his job to hopefully link up the play to the rest of the team. Whilst at the same time Fernandes and Van der Beek would be ahead of him, keeping some of the Villa midfield deeper. But you can see the strength of Villa's shape is through the centre here, so with two centre forwards in Watkins and Ings, they were able to cover both of the United centre-backs. Coutinho was able to cover the sole pivot that was Fred, so playing through the centre was almost impossible. And the obvious free men, as you can see in these situations, are Dalot and Luke Shaw. Ollie Watkins and Danny Ings were well positioned throughout the 90, so that they could look to press the centre-backs if the opportunity arose. But perhaps even more importantly, Coutinho would make sure that Fred never had space as a solo pivot to look to make the passes, initially at least. And the fullbacks really were the key men for Ten Hag today. They could be used in several ways. Initially, Ten Hag could keep both of the fullbacks much deeper, rather than getting them to immediately overlap. This would mean a free, easy pass out to the fullback, and here we see the weakness of a 4-4-2 diamond, because now United had 3 men wide, whilst Villa only had 2. This meant that McGinn had to do a lot of decision making. If he came out to Luke Shaw, there was now a 2 versus 1 in these wide regions, and one interesting thing about Ten Hag's setup today is that he didn't always encourage Rashford to stay wide in these situations. Rather, Rashford would tuck in, drawing in Matty Cash with him, freeing up a space in this region. So we would see Shaw look to go directly to Rashford, at the same time Fernandes was making the run in behind, because the Villa midfield would have to shift across to try and cover that. So the space when the Villa forward was concentrated on the centre-backs, with McGinn being a central midfielder rather than a winger, meant that Shaw often had space to receive the ball in the left-back region. And when he did receive, he had options, as he could then move up the pitch unchallenged at times if McGinn was central. But here we see a common occurrence. McGinn from central midfield would look to be the man to cover Shaw so that he couldn't advance up the pitch as discussed. However, this means that Fernandes and Rashford in behind him have a 2 versus 1 against Cash. So Shaw chips the ball, and despite Kamara looking to come across to cover, Fernandes had the head start, so he can make the run into the space vacated by Rashford, because Rashford moving in central has also drawn Matty Cash out of position. Alternatively, Rashford could push up against the fullback, and this would leave a lot of free space here, allowing Fernandes to receive under not much pressure, where he could then get his head up and look to create for the rest of the team. Here we see an alternative situation. Again, Shaw has space out wide, and we can see that McGinn, from central midfield, has quite a lot of distance to cover so that he can get to him before the switch arrives. By the time the ball does arrive, McGinn is caught in 2 minds. As if he presses Shaw, Fernandes is free, but if he stays on Fernandes, Shaw now has room to progress up the pitch. In the end, he doesn't really cover either situation. So Fernandes makes the run into the space in behind McGinn, and he has a fair bit of space in which to operate and look to make a pass. So as the game progressed, Villa knew that they couldn't always depend on McGinn to move out to Shaw because of the situation in this wide region. So instead, the onus was now placed on Coutinho from attacking midfield. When the ball went wide, he would go out to cover Shaw. But this would lead to the rare instances where Fred at pivot would be free to receive the ball. And it should be discussed that Fred is not the best single pivot, especially for a Ten Hag system. So just imagine if instead of Fred in this region, it was, for example, Martinez, who is great on the ball. So when he received the ball here, he could do a lot more damage. And we do have a tactical analysis of Martinez at United, which you can watch now, so that will be linked in the corner. But this general occurrence of Coutinho moving wide actually led to one of the United goals. Here we see Coutinho initially is on Fred as he had been doing all game. However, Shaw is in acres of space out wide. But now Coutinho is looking to cover Luke Shaw, which means this is a rare instance now where Fred can potentially receive the ball in the midfield. And because of Fernandes and Van der Beek being fairly high up, he would have had quite a bit of space to operate it had he received the ball. As the game progressed, Coutinho now had the responsibility of looking to pick up Shaw, allowing McGinn to remain deeper on Fernandes. However, before, Coutinho would have been highly effective in containing Fred in the pivot role. But with him now covering Shaw in the wide region, that changed slightly. It meant that all of a sudden, Fred would be able to receive between the lines in the midfield, a situation that would have been impossible before Coutinho started to be the man to cover wide. So here we see that Coutinho is still out of position, and now Fred has space to receive in the midfield. He can turn, and Fred may not be the most gifted on the ball, but with enough time and space, he can pick out a dangerous pass. This pass turns out to be into Sancho, who can then make the pass to Rashford, who runs onto it, leading, surprisingly, to an own goal. But another thing that Ten Hag looked to do a lot of was encourage wide rotations on either side. So, it wouldn't always be Shaw being the deepest with Fernandes in midfield and the winger out wide, or vice versa on this side. Instead, we could often see Fernandes drop deep, Luke Shaw overlapping and Rashford moving here. Or Rashford, and especially Sancho on the other side, were also happy to move deeper in these areas to receive the ball, and they would have opportunities to look for slip balls, usually into Martial, who was making good runs. So again, we see the spaces in the wide regions, as the Villa front two are covering the centre-backs, and although a Villa midfielder does look to move out to cover him, by the time he arrives, Dalot has controlled possession. But, again, this is the rotations we spoke about. Sancho has dropped deep into the midfield region, drawing the attention of a Villa midfielder, and Van der Beek is tucked in, so now Dino has to move in central as well. Sancho can then make the run on the outside as he can get away from his midfielder and look to receive the pass back from Van der Beek, although it doesn't work out in this instance. But what really opened up the game for United today was how Ten Hag adapted the use of his fullbacks. The initial idea for Ten Hag was initially to have one fullback pushing much higher up, whilst the other would invert into the midfield alongside Fred. Here, Shaw is the man moving higher up and able to receive wide. But more interestingly, Dalot takes this as his cue to invert into the midfield. And in the reverse instance, we see a similar pattern. Initially, Shaw and Dalot are both playing as traditional fullbacks, but as soon as the ball goes out wide towards Dalot, however, we can see that the strength of Villa's shape was always in the midfield. So despite doing this, United didn't gain that much of an advantage, as it was still relatively a 4 versus 4 where Villa could maintain their stability. So instead, what Ten Hag opted for was for one of the fullbacks to join the back line, so that now they had a 3 versus 2, whilst the other one could then push higher and still be the free option out wide. This now created problems for Villa, especially Coutinho, as this would be too easy for United to build out as they had a 3 versus 2. So Coutinho would often get drawn out towards Maguire, and this would leave Fred in space in the midfield. This led to a few problems for Villa, but a few opportunities for United. First of all, they would still have the option of the wide pass out to the fullback or a dropping winger. But now it was also a 3 versus 3 in the midfield, and with Fred being the pivot, Gerrard didn't want him to get the time on the ball to spray passes around. So the whole Villa midfield was often then drawn higher to try and cover for this. This was also an opportunity now for United, as there was now a bit more space between the lines. So we often saw Martial began to drop deeper, whilst Fernandes could push higher up. So now penetrative passes could find the men between the lines. Again, imagine if it was Martinez who was playing at centre back, and he's an excellent passer, so he could make those passes even quicker. This situation even led to one of the United goals. So before, United had just been building with Lindelof and Maguire, but now Dalot is staying deep, meaning they have a back three. So again, the Villa forwards will be looking to press if United do progress too high up the pitch. So Coutinho is now higher than he would have been, as we saw he was looking to begin to press. Again, this means Fred has some space in the midfield. Also note that Martial was willing to drop deeper in these scenarios, as it often meant that the Villa midfield was higher than they usually would have been, creating a bit more space between the lines. So we see this in the lead up to the first United goal. United are now building up with a dedicated back three, and Coutinho had begun to move out to press, so he was higher than he would have usually been, that being the other side of Fred. Again, there's still the possibility to go out wide, which United do. So as Coutinho had begun to press, Kamara is higher than he usually would have been, because he was looking to cover the movement of Fred in behind Coutinho. This means there's now more space between the lines, where a penetrative pass from Dalot can find Martial, which changes the game completely. Martial is able to turn and find Fernandes, and as discussed, out wide, because Villa weren't using wingers, United had big advantages. So here, it is now a 3 versus 1 against Cash. Cash has to cover Rashford, so Shaw can arrive on the overlap and plays in a perfect cross to Sancho at the back post, who's then going to finish. But in this system, again, we can see the importance of the single pivot for Ten Hag. So either Martinez can take up this role, and he would be able to do it excellently, but he also wants a deep progressor in the centre-back region. So you can see why United is heavily linked to De Jong, as they could now solve that problem. But if you enjoyed this video, leave a like. The defensive pressing system of Ten Hag analysis is coming very soon. Let me know what you thought of the tactical board style of video. And on my Patreon, I also have an in-depth 25-minute analysis of Pep and Klopp's very first meeting using the tactical board. So if you want to check that out, click the Patreon in the top right. But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.